the load, also known as the weight that you are lifting, and the reps that you do are inversely related. A good example of this is you physically could not, if you are actually doing what this says, you would not be able to do a 10 RPE, meaning you are completely burning out, you are gassed, you can only do one rep. You wouldn't be doing a 10 RPE for one rep at a sub-maximal load, meaning that if you're at a 10 RPE for one rep, you're most likely hitting your max. Now, we're gonna dive more into it in this video, so don't worry if I lost you there. Hi, I'm Kelsey Nanini, certified strength and conditioning specialist and certified nutritionist. I help you go from frequent gym goer to strong, confident, educated athlete. Which is why we are covering the inverse relationship between load and reps and why this matters when you are strength training. So in order to better understand this relationship and better be able to utilize this relationship within your training, you must know your 1 rep max, or at least know your multiple rep max. You can always refer to this table, which is in the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning textbook. It is for the most part helpful. However, there are a few things that you need to know about this table. The newer research that has come out that essentially negates what this table is going over. Part of that is that loads and reps aren't always linear. In fact, they can be curvilinear. I cannot say that word for the life of me. Meaning that you could have an assigned load and rep, but even if it says to do it, there are cases where you may not always be able to perform said assignment. So that is going to vary on the exercise type, the volume overall, amongst many other things. Another thing to remember is that this table is based off of a single set and not multiple sets. Typically in a workout, you aren't going to be just doing one set. You're going to be doing multiple sets. So that is where this table does have a little bit of a flaw. Another thing is that, machines and free weights do vary. You have a little bit more assistance on a machine. You can control the weight a little bit better with a machine. And so the relationship of load and reps can vary there. Same thing with like an accessory movement and a compound movement. Typically, the load to rep assignment within an accessory movement can't actually be completed. The rep assignment based on the load actually is higher than what you may sometimes be able to complete an accessory movement. So just know that, but for the most part, this table is fairly dependable. But with anything, it's going to vary based on the situation, based on the person, all that. That's very common in fitness as a whole, which is fun. So back to 1 rep max. There are essentially 3 ways, there's probably others out there, but these are the 3 main ways that you can find your 1 rep max. The first is a manual test. You're actually physically testing out with various lifts, specifically the lifts you want to get stronger in. You're going to test out for your 1 rep max. For the sake of this video, I am not going to be covering that, but you can comment below if you'd be interested in me going over the process of testing to find your 1 rep max, and I can definitely do a video on that in the future. The other 2 ways, one of which is to base it off of your multiple rep max. So if 1 rep max isn't necessarily appropriate, maybe you physically aren't able to lift under that much load, you can always use an equation to essentially find your 1 rep max based off of your 6 rep max or your 10 rep max. And then the last is to use a calculator to find it out. You basically use a lift, the reps you did and the load you utilized, and it'll give you the table of like 100% of your 1 rep max, 97%, and so on and so forth. I did drop my favorite link to use in the video description below, so you can utilize that if you would like to. Another piece to this equation is that your load and reps utilized will vary based on what the training goal is. If you're trying to gain muscle, you'll likely be doing hypertrophy style training. That's really what gaining muscle means. With this, you would be doing about 67 to 85% of your 1 rep max throughout your lifts. It's going to vary based on the volume you're doing, the exercise you're doing, and so on and so forth. And then along with hypertrophy style training, the reps. So for about 2/3 to 3/4 of your lifts, you're going to want to be using the 6 to 12 rep range. For the other third to fourth of your volume, you could be using a 1 to 6 rep range or a 12 to 20 rep range. If the goal is to gain strength, to get stronger, maybe you have certain lifts that you want to achieve this within, then you're gonna wanna be using 85% of your 1 rep max or higher. This is really only specific to the lifts you're actually wanting to get stronger in, and still going off of strength for your rep ranges. 2/3 to 3/4 of your volume should be about 1 to 6 reps. And that again is only for the exercises that you want to get stronger in. For the other exercises, the more accessory movements or lifts that you don't necessarily want to get stronger in, you're gonna be using a 6 to 12 rep range. So still on the lower end of reps, not quite getting to that more endurance-based rep range that you can kind of toy around with in hypertrophy. Now, bringing it back to the example of building your lower body that I've been using throughout this series, for this specifically, you most likely would want to use actually a combination of strength and hypertrophy to not just get stronger in certain lifts, which can aid in growth, but also for the specific goal of hypertrophy, which is obviously gaining muscle. That is what hypertrophy means, is gaining muscle tissue. Lastly, we're going to talk about how we're going to progress load. How do you know when you can progress load? Now, I think something important to remember here is that load is not the only way to progress a lift. This is something that I often see misconstrued, in that in order to achieve progressive overload, you have to increase your weight. The thing is, you may not always be able to increase load, but you could increase reps or sets or decrease rest time, increase the time under tension or slow down your tempo. There's a ton of different ways to progress a lift, and I want to make sure I'm very clear in that you don't always have to feel the pressure of constantly trying to lift heavier. The biggest thing is to remember that your muscle knows tension, not load. So if you're constantly trying to increase load just for clout to say that you can lift heavier, but your form is shit and you're constantly in pain, then the act of lifting heavier just to say you're progressing isn't worth it. That was just a tangent, but let's talk more about how to progress load. First, how do you know when to increase? We would use a rule called the 2 for 2 rule. We would use a rule called the 2 for 2 rule. I don't know why every time I try to say that it is so hard. This is essentially saying that if you are able to perform 2 or more reps over the assigned rep goal, so for instance, your assigned rep goal is 10 reps, you're able to complete 12 or more for 2 consecutive weeks or longer, that is your sign to increase your load. But how do you know how much to increase by? If you or your client are less trained, you're more in the beginner stages, you're newer to lifting, or you maybe just are a little bit weaker, you're gonna wanna stick to an increase of 2.5 to 5 pounds for upper body and 5 to 10 pounds for lower body. For more of the advanced trainees, for upper body, you're gonna wanna increase by about 5 to 10 pounds, and for lower body, about 10 to 15 pounds. Now, let's say that you notice a huge difference in your upper and lower body. Let's say that you have a super weak upper body and a super strong lower body. The goal is obviously to make that a little bit more even, but for this case, you could stick to like a 2.5 to 5 pound increase for upper and the higher end of the 10 to 15 pound increase for lower. Another tidbit to remember, like I said, load is not the only way to progress a lift. So it is important to remember that this rule, this 2 for 2 rule of being able to increase load, is subjective. You may not always be able to increase load every single lift, and it is a huge pressure to put on yourself to think that you can do that. So just keep in mind, it is not required or necessary to always increase load. There will be times where you also strategically pull back. There will be times where you're in a different phase and you aren't able to increase load. So just remember, it's not always the case. It's just a generalized rule. We covered load and reps, which is a very nice transition into our next video, which is all about volume, putting load, reps, and sets all together. I'll see you in the next one.